we have a real treat for you now. This is our closing keynote. And all the way from Baltimore as part of a European tour, we have the author of Managing Chaos. We have Lisa Welchman with us to talk about Makers of Worlds. So please, everybody, give a warm welcome to Lisa.
So I had no idea there was going to be beverage. And so I really do like Prosecco. I'm just going to drink a little bit of it because it's kind of tasty. But we kind of made it to the end, didn't we? I'm surprised. I have a lot of little notes here that I made for myself, and I had completely made this presentation before I arrived because I'm a governance person, so sort of process-wise or whatever, I can procrastinate, but I get there at the end. But I've been sitting into a lot of the sessions, and so I was sort of tweaking things. So pardon me if I occasionally look at notes. I have to say I've had a great time. It's not often the case that I actually want to go to all the talks at events that I speak at, and they were really quite interesting, and I learned a lot. So thank you for all of you all who spoke. I really, really appreciate you making it a quite good time. So I have to ask you a question. This isn't audience participation. You can self-reflect. How many of you all in your work have sort of felt sort of ethically or morally a little bit dirty? Yeah. So that's a real challenge. And so I want to kind of go into that space with you all today. It's going to be a little bit of a meandering, but I am a structure girl, so I promise you it will come together at the end. Right? So if you hang with me a little bit on this journey, I want to think about that and talk a little bit about sort of ethics, and not in a preachy kind of way, but in a really practical kind of way. My background's really different than all of yours. I've been in the digital space for over 20 years, actually. I've been in the internet and web space for as many years as my son's been alive, which is 21. And prior to that, I worked with collaborative technologies like Lotus Notes development. And prior to that, I was very into HyperCard. And prior to that, symbolic logic and philosophy. Right? So I kind of come at things from a very structured sort of way. And I have a hands-on web background, like I learned HTML, right, that I could do. I coded pages for Netscape back in the day. I managed the web publishing infrastructure at Cisco Systems when they were inventing and evolving e-commerce. So I've kind of been all over the place and learned about large-scale digital development very early. And so if there's any advantage that I have, that's it. I've just been looking at big, messed up digital stuff for a long time, right? And so not as long as you could. There were definitely people prior to that, but in terms of the commercialization of digital, I've been looking at it for quite some time. And I've had my hands off of it in terms of being a maker probably since 1999. So I don't do anything practical. I sit around all day, people call me up, and they say things to me that are about the equivalent of, hi, our team's fighting about how to make stuff. Will you come in and make them stop? Right? So that's my job. I do that all day long. And it's fun. It's interesting. But what it also means is that I've been watching you, right? And I've been seeing what you do and how you collaborate. And so I actually have a lot of compassion for this spot that everyone's in right now. So I want to talk about that a little bit and then maybe give you some tips. So there's been a lot of dreamy talks, which is really great. And I've been quite frightened sitting out here because people have just sort of scraped at where I was going to go with my talk. Like, you see them coming in and then they're like, oh no, I'm not going to go that way. And so I was just sitting there thinking, I'm going to have to redo everything. But nobody quite hit it, but everyone came near, which means there's actually already in place, for those of you all who've been here a couple of days or even just today, a lot of context for what I'm going to say. Interrupt me if you'd like. Disagree with me if you'd like. We're starting a little bit late, so I'll try not to talk too long and stay sort of within our time frame. I was told not to rush my talk, but I certainly am not going to take us over too much. So I hope that sounds good. Yeah? Okay, that sounds fair enough. This is a clicker. I'm really bad about this particular thing. Let's see if we can make it work. Okay, I'm sure you all are really familiar with this quote. This came from an essay written in the 1950s around sort of collaboration, and someone asked Isaac Asimov to write an essay about how do you come up with good ideas and new ideas, and what is that? And I've heard this so much, and it was so great, it was validating for me because I had picked this quote already, which is that, it's really not about new ideas. It's about putting people who have different sorts of ideas together in a room to solve a problem, right? And so that's really good because there really isn't too much new under the sun. And this conference, I think, is a really good example of that. And so it would have been really interesting, in my mind, I was sort of sitting back there fantasizing of, what if we actually had a problem to solve over these past couple of days? There's probably so many different minds and disciplines and perspectives and capabilities in this room right now that we probably actually could have done a lot of really serious work. So I think that's, stop making things up so much, stop making so many new things is really something really important. So what do I think? And I'm going to get a little bit philosophical. That's my background, and I'm just excited that I'm not giving a straight-ahead digital governance talk, although I'll talk about that a little bit because I can't help it. So what do I think is actually going on with us, right, with you? And I think one of the things that we actually have to be really honest about is that we're actually making something new. And I don't mean new as in unique. I'm not particularly that concerned about whether or not we're doing something unique. I'm not very precious about that sort of thing at all. So that might feel good for people to feel unique or new, but it is that we're creating something, right? And something that I believe that you might disagree with me is that it's naturally going to be a reflection of who we are, right? So in some ways, I'm sort of a little bit of a determinist, right? When we make something, it will necessarily be a reflection of our values, our beliefs, all of those sorts of things. We might try otherwise, but even in that trying, it sometimes becomes even more of who we are, right? And so we know we're imperfect. Or does anyone think that we're not imperfect? Okay, so we know that we're imperfect, and we know that we're creating this thing. So what are we going to do about that? Right? If we're making something and it will be a manifestation of us, our beliefs, our doubts, our thoughts, our good things, our bad things, and we know that we're imperfect, what are we going to do about it? And so I think a lot of times we just kind of sit around and feel bad about that, right? That's that dirty feeling you get at work. You're like, okay, maybe I don't really want them addicted to this, but okay. And you just keep going. You keep wondering about it. So I'm going to try and tell you what to do, right? I could be completely wrong, but somebody said yesterday, shamefully, that they were a management consultant, which means they don't ever say anything. And I almost wanted to jump up and scream, right? I am notorious for just coming in and being highly prescriptive, right? I think you ought to do this. Right? Pete's called me his mom several times, which I don't know. I mean, I know I have gray hair and I look old, but not that old, but we'll just let that slide. But I do have that capacity of I think you should actually do it this way. Because the worst thing that happens is you're going to try and it doesn't work. And usually we're not talking about life or death situations. And I think you all do that too. You take your best stab at something, you give it a try, and if it doesn't work, you make adjustments, right? So we've made this thing. What are we going to do about it? So there's just this feeling that we have that something's sort of gone wrong in this world, particularly if you're working with digital technologies and the integration of things. I was working with a university that's trying to integrate sort of their experience of digital signage with what's going online, there's just sort of this big integrated morphing of the real world and the digital world that's coming together, but it's not quite feeling good. Something feels like it's going wrong. And I went to an event maybe a couple of years ago, and I think this is maybe the last time I'm going to be allowed to tell this story because I've been telling it a lot, and even I'm tired of it, which means it must be getting old. The only reason why I went was, it's called Internet 2020. It was in Washington, D.C. It was sponsored by Duke University Law School, and the only reason I was going was because Vint Cerf, widely called the inventor of the Internet, and Sir Tim, widely called the inventor of the World Wide Web, were going to be there. Right? And it was a small room like this, right? And they were speaking, and I thought, at that time I was writing a book about digital governance, and people were saying, no, Lisa, it's not digital governance, it's web governance. I was like, no, web governance is the governance of the World Wide Web, and internet governance is the governance of the internet. Digital is the governance of digital within an organization. And I was going to get a selfie with Vince Cerf, Sir Tim, and me, and be like internet governance, web governance, digital governance. I failed, mostly because I am sort of a little bit shy and timid, and Tim Berners-Lee is definitely an introvert. He did actually hand me a glass of wine and looked at me and sort of scooted away. Vince Cerf talked to me a little bit and told me like sort of like a bad granddad joke, and that was about that was like about the extent of it. But at this particular event, it was really interesting. There was kind of this lamenting, not negative, but kind of just like bummer vibe. It was mostly about regulatory stuff and net neutrality, whatever was going on about internet governance at that time, whatever the hot topic is, and there's always one all the time, and it comes up and it goes down. And you know, this came out of Vince Cerf's mouth, and I was like, wow, that's okay. And he kind of looked down about it. And then I thought about other things, like the fact that Tim Berners-Lee has started the World Wide Web Foundation, of which I'm a supporter, and that we actually are having to push and promote this idea that the web is for everyone, that everyone needs access, and that we're having to proactively do these things, which we thought were sort of in the culture of what we do, right? But it's not actually happening, right? It's not happening. And then maybe a couple weeks ago or whatever, did you guys see this as well? This was kind of a big deal, was online, this idea of the stuff that we're making, and just this idea that, yeah, we leaned fully forward into making all this great stuff. We have the internet, the web, it's supposed to be absolutely fabulous, and something's not quite right. So what do we do about it, right? What are we going to do about those things? And you know, I know BJ Fogg. I met him at an event years ago. It must have been when he was just sort of first starting out in his work on this, and you know, the article, this particular article sort of stems around the work that he's doing, and it kind of skirts over the fact where he kind of feels bummed out that people are writing books like Hooked, and these people are his students, and that these things are turning in a direction that maybe he doesn't want. So what are we going to do about it? Are there things that we can do necessarily? So that's thought number one. Put that in this side of your brain. Okay, now I'm going to talk to you on one slide, technically, about what I do all day, because it's going to be relevant in a minute. So I've written a book called Managing Chaos, Digital Governance by Design. It's a decent book. I think it's pretty good. People hate the word governance, right? They think it means controls and bureaucracies or whatever, so I'm going to say you're wrong about that. It doesn't. You can have a governing framework that's agile. You can have a governing framework that's open. You can have one that's tight, which is why it's by design. Right? It's sort of fitness to purpose, however you would like to be that, have that governing mechanism work. It could, the governing framework could mean that everybody gets to make their own decision real time where they are. That's one, right? Doesn't particularly work well all the time, but that could be one as well. So I just want to talk to you about why I do this work and how I think things happen when you're talking about the flow and the integration of the new. So I say digital governance, but just toss that out, right? It doesn't really matter that it's digital governance. Let's just talk about adopting any new technology or any new anything. How does that actually work? So at some point, it launches, right? It launches, it goes, people do stuff. Somebody bought a URL inside your company, you put some stuff online. If it's social channels, somebody logs in and, you know, gets a social media account, you launch it, and people try to do things, right? At Cisco Systems, somebody brought a URL, and they started dumping all their tech documentation online. You know, in the mid-90s, they had a 250-page website because they threw all their tech doc online. So people put things online, and you try things. That's great. Innovation, new, we all like that part, right? We're just trying stuff out, makes you feel free, it's wonderful. At some point, right around the peak of this first little valley, somebody goes, oh, I found something that works, right? At that point, what happens in an enterprise or even in a market space? People start to copy it, right? So if at that point you don't start to come up with some standards and governing mechanisms, they'll replicate with imperfections, which is okay, maybe, but inside a single organization, it means they just start making the same thing several different ways. It's like the two parallel lines that, like this, if you tilt them even just a little bit and you add time, they're super far apart. Right, so this is a really good spot, that bump. If you found something that you want to replicate and scale, if you found something you want to replicate and scale to actually govern it. If you don't, you fall into chaos, and then you need to hire somebody like me to pull you out of it to basic management and tend to this wonderful nirvana state where everything's working well together, it's all aligned. If the business moves, the new channel moves, and it's oh, swoopingly wonderful, right? So that's how it works. It could be anything, right? The problem is that different things launch at different times, so different things are in different states, right? So this is how it works. This is how technology has always worked. It's worked like this all of the time. There's nothing new under the sun about this. I always tell people, there's really nothing that smart that I'm doing, right? I'm just trying to actually manage the integration of new technologies into an organization. So you've got your growth, you've got your sinking into chaos. If you don't actually effectively figure out what you're doing and define it, then you're going to need governance. This is going to lead you into basic management, which is what do I have, who's touching it, and who's doing it. And then you have this sort of evolving up into a responsive state, right, that you can happen. I've never met anybody who is actually functioning in this responsive state that I made up in my head, which is sort of digital nirvana, which is where the business model or the mission of the organization is married effectively with all of the dynamics of what's being created. And it may actually be that. It may actually be a fantasy state that can never be achieved, but that you can strive towards, right? But when you think about it, that's pretty much life, right? So what if you can't ever get here? It doesn't mean that you actually don't go in that direction. It just means that you might never get there, but it's still, a good idea to try. So it's about the journey, like where we're going, where we're choosing to go. Why is there a little dot there? Has that always been there? My little arrow? Oh, you want me to move it? There, that's better. Okay. You guys why didn't somebody say something? Like I would have just moved it long ago. These are the things I'm obviously not a visual person. What?
Just fix chaos.
That's it. Done. So we've got this sort of responsive state of things that are going on. It's kind of like moving from responsive state to responsive state to responsive state. And so this sort of zigzaggy line that is sort of like that maturity curve that I have is just trying to express one simple thing. And if you're, sort of into mysticism and Eastern philosophy and those sorts of things, it's about the journey. Right? But that's just true. We're just constantly piling technology innovation on top of technology innovation on top of technology innovation, right? So you better have a really good time on your way, because when you get there, it's probably going to disintegrate and dissolve into something else, and you're going to have to pick it up and move again, right? And if it doesn't disintegrate into something else and pick it up and move again, then whatever entity you're in will just completely disintegrate. That's the pivot everybody's talking about all the time. How can you have an organization have a sustained business model over hundreds of years or decades, right? You have to keep evolving and changing, which means you launch and you respond. So it's just a natural thing. It's like an inhalation and an exhalation or a heartbeat, right? Nothing just goes wild crazy like that all the time, but somehow there's an expectation that that's going to happen. So that responsive state is actually going to atrophy and move on. So you're going to be never arriving, always moving all the time. And so you need to just accept that. That is the state. That is the way. That's how things work, right? And that's sort of a theme of what I want to say today, is that that's how things work, right? So that's thought number 2. Park that in the other quadrant of your brain, right? So I mentioned earlier, or maybe I didn't, that I was a philosophy major. I actually started out a music major, voice opera. I'm not going to sing. I tried to sing the other day. It's one of those skills you have to practice or you don't get good. You don't stay good, right? So you actually are maybe glad that I'm not going to sing. And I was really interested in philosophy of language, symbolic logic, and aesthetics a little bit, but I'm not really that romantic about things. I don't really care about beauty, right? I care about systems thinking. I wrote my thesis on Keith Gunderson's book, Mentality in Machines. Right, so one of the very first books that was kind of knocked down Alan Turing and the idea of can machines think. And so I've got that little bit of a background, so that's just me giving you some sort of street cred. So I thought what would be a good idea would be to kind of marry some of the maker problems that you might have up to some of these big philosophical ideas. Absolutism versus relativism, good versus evil, can machines think? This is actually classic now. It's been around long enough that this is actually a classic issue. What does it mean to lead a good life, right? Free will versus determinism. We all know these if you all were forced to take this course, work in school, or think about it. So for this one, for us, is there a right way and a wrong way to make things? Is there an absolutely right way to make things, an absolutely wrong way to make things? Are the things that we make good, or are they evil? That's something that might come up when you're having one of those dirty thoughts, right? You're thinking, wow, is this good, or am I actually going to contribute to that horrible thing? This was another one. Are makers free, or is their work determined by the organizations that pay them? Right? So this one I get a lot, which is, I would do good, except my boss won't let me. Right? I really want to do good, but my boss won't let me. Can machines think? I don't even have to do anything to that one, right, for what we do for a living. And what does it mean to live a good life? To live a good life could be, are the things that we're making contributing to a good life? So these are all issues and things that people have talked about. And I was kind of excited because I had written this, and then people talked about them. And so I was validated, right, that I had actually come up with some things that were actually relevant to you. But 3 of these I don't really want to talk about because they're more like good versus evil. Can machines think? What does it mean to lead a good life? Okay, those are really interesting, and I could talk about them, but we don't have that much time. So we're going to take those away, right? And I'm going to focus on these 2, right? Because I think these are the ones where I can actually give you some practical advice, right? Is there a right way and a wrong way to make things? And are makers free, or is their work determined by the organizations that pay them? So here's the first one. Is there a right way and a wrong way to make things? What do you think? I like it depends. Consultant. There's some billable hours in that. It depends. And I will tell you why. Right way, wrong thing? Kind of a silly question, right? Kind of a baby, sophomore kind of question. So I think the answer to that really is, practically speaking, yes. Like, if you don't make something right, it just doesn't work fundamentally, right? If you're a coder and you code and you don't know how to code, you're not going to be able to parse that code, or you're not going to be able to run that program. Designs are either ineffective more or less, right? And of course, we know there are many right and wrong ways to make things, right? That's the it depends part. So story. So this March, I went to Costa Rica. So I didn't intend to go to Costa Rica. I was supposed to go to Chile with a friend of mine for a yoga retreat. And we waited too long and it got full. But we decided we were going to go somewhere anyway, so we went to Costa Rica. And so one of the little tourist things that we did was we got on a bus and bumped up a hill. We went and watched them make chocolate, right? And it was great. The whole thing was go and drink hot chocolate, the real hot chocolate you've never had before in your life. So we went, and it was absolutely great. And it was kind of odd because they actually made you do all the work. So you had to stand over this hot stove and roast the cocoa beans, and then you had to sweat. It's really quite hot. You had to sweat, and I'm wearing mosquito cover jacket, so I'm super sweating. You have to grind up these things or whatever, and then you have to, she did this hard part, which was shaking to get the husk off and all that other sort of thing. And then they put it in a pot. Oh, then you have to grind it. You have to put it through the grinder. And then you put it in a pot down here, and you make hot cocoa, and you drink it. And you go, this is really good. It maybe isn't really that good, but you say that because you've worked so hard, right, to get it done, that you have to feel like that this was really worth the experience. And it was an experience for me. It was absolutely fantastic. I had never really thought that much about chocolate making. I liked talking to the people. I could not speak the language, but we tried to communicate. It was an experience. And I probably won't forget that one, right? It was really quite delightful. And it was good chocolate. And I learned that chocolate's a really good face scrub. Things like that you learn along the way. So that's one way to get it. And that's another way. Right, so neither one of them is right or wrong, right? They're just sort of different sorts of experiences. And the really thing, and I think you were talking about this earlier, is what outcomes are you looking for, right? And so it doesn't really matter, and I don't judge, right? I don't care when I go in an organization actually what you're making. I mean, personally, I have some philosophies. There's types of organizations I might not work for because philosophically or morally or ethically I don't want to. But I'm not really judging about the quality of things or what you're actually doing. It's more like, what kind of outcome do you want? And how can we optimize so that we can make sure that those outcomes will occur? So that what you want to have happen will come into existence, the experience. And we're talking about that path we're talking about. We're not talking that moment of exciting nirvana that's never going to happen. We're talking about the journey, right? And the quality of the journey, the quality of the experience of the journey. And the answer for me, answer number one, is you put the right people in the room. So we've been around the edges of this all the last 2 days, right? And so, which was exciting for me. And so I think, Isaac had it going, which is we've got the answers already. We just haven't created the environment where the answers are going to happen, right? Because we silo ourselves. Silos are necessary. It's important, actually, to have silos. We can't all work in one big lump. It doesn't work effectively. Group dynamics don't work that way. But from time to time, you actually have to sort of integrate your silos so that you can come up with good answers. So this is a gentleman named Eric Fisher. Is anyone familiar with his work? He is really interesting. I've never met him before. If he knew how much I talked about him, he might be uncomfortable, because I talk about him a lot. And so his point is the part I've highlighted, which we are moving so fast in development, right, in making things, that we can't keep, in alignment with the unintended outcomes, right? We're just moving fiercely forward very quickly. And he says the G word, which I love. We have to supplement our suite of governance mechanisms, right? We need to bring other people into the room, and I added and designers, right? To make sure, right, that when we're making things, we're making the right choices. I've said to 1 million people in the hall this week already that, we're talking around the edges of ethics and squarely down psychology, and what other things have we talked about? Other types of disciplines, sociology, anthropology, right? We've talked sort of around the edges of that, but we haven't really talked about things like ethicists, right? People who actually think about these things. So, and I said to someone already, or two, when you're working on a project with a client and you have a new client and the first thing they do is hand you a piece of paper and draw something horrible on it and say, make me something like this, it makes you crazy, right? Because you're like, wait, there's a process to go through so that we can actually come to the right design. So I would argue that you maybe don't have the capacity, the same capacity as an ethicist or other people, to actually tell whether or not what you're doing is good or bad or evil or is in line, and that you need to integrate those people into the process in order for that to work well. So we can't really control this growth that's coming on over and over and over again, this sort of recapitulation of growth that's happening. It's a natural phenomenon. So this is a statement from Lisa that you may or may not agree with. I don't believe we can control much of anything. Stuff moves. The stuff moves, man. It just moves. I don't care if you try and hold it back, nature is going to move, and we are part of nature. Stuff moves, right? But we can influence the nature and direction of that growth. That's what we can do, right? So Eric Fisher's come up with this idea of midstream modulation. So the reason why people don't like the G word, governance, is because they think it's a control mechanism that stifles innovation and stops people from doing cool things, right? And so it can be like that if it's done poorly. So if you're thinking about that sort of curve where we had the launch at the beginning, if you try to govern something right at the very beginning, it's a huge mistake. You will stifle innovation. People won't come up with new eyes. That's not the right place either. If you try to govern it the way we're trying to govern it, the internet and the web, which is after the fact, you get too much policy and too many crazy rules doing a specific instance, addressing specific current concerns for specific demographics, specific countries, right? You get this heavily regulated machine which everybody pushes against and nobody wants to deal with. So Eric Fisher's idea, and it really comes from working with nanotechnologies and stem cell research, right, which is once you know what you want to make, you've come up with a good idea, you've tried it out a little bit, before you scale the sucker, right, get these people in the room and start asking, are these the right things to do? What types of questions should we ask? So in the midstream, right, in the midstream of development is when we should start doing these ethical concerns. This means that the governing mechanism isn't going to overly control what you're doing, but you're going to do some things that are going to be important. So these are some guesses from me about what I think you can ask in the midstream. I am not an ethicist, but again, highly prescriptive. So it's a start. Could be completely wrong. So what's the opposite of the good experience I think micro-creation fulfills? Is it possible? right? Everybody thinks they're doing good work and that they're doing good things. But what's the opposite of it? And is it actually possible in the world that you've created that that thing could happen, right? And if so, is that a good or a bad thing? Right? This is a good one. What types of behaviors, good and bad, am I enabling with this build? Right? So that's the little thing in the back of your head that's telling you maybe I'm making one of those not so great addictive things, right? And you kind of feel, but like just put it out in the front, separate it from the work that you're doing in an interdisciplinary group and have a conversation about it. You may continue and proceed, but at least you understand the landscape of what you're doing it and you can manage it and you can look for it, right? Or you can be prepared to address it when the public comes to get you, right? Whatever that turns out to be, right? Who benefits from my creation and who loses, right? We're always talking about upside. If you're financed by a business, it's all upside, right? Who's losing in that? And related to that, which is, do I understand the full supply chain, right? So this has to do with the manufacture of our cell phones or all sorts of things. Do you really understand this full supply chain of what is going on? Or are you just in the, oh, this was a delightful experience right here, and you just put a golden box around it, and it just kind of exists in the middle of nowhere? Have you actually thought about that, right? And my favorite, is this the whole story? Is this inclusive? Right? And so most of the time the answer to that is no, because nobody could know the whole story. No one person could know the whole story. So have you actually thought about that 360 degrees? And more importantly, who actually knows the answers to these questions? It's probably not the designer, right? It's probably a bunch of people, right? So that's not a diss or a stab, that's just more of a truth, right? So we need to be interdisciplinary and think about who's in the room at this midstream moment when we can still change it, right? So maybe you made a crazy addictive app, but you haven't really deployed it yet. So don't just deploy it and go, there's nothing I could do about it. Actually see what you can do to actually mitigate that, right? At that moment in the midstream before you scale, right? You know, so you're going to scale with imperfection, or you're going to scale with moral imperfections or ethical imperfections, but you're going to scale, right? So make sure you do your work, and it won't be perfect, and that's okay. Here's the permission slip I'm giving you. It's okay, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? There's going to be a few immoral apps out there, but they'll be better if they were considered, right? Rather than sort of blindly guessing. So second one, are makers free, or is their work determined by the organizations that pay them? Any ideas?
Can you not choose the organizations who are going to pay you, and therefore your work can be free to make the choices that are necessary towards the goal you have?
That's possible, but they still own you, right? It's just a better owner, right? So you can make a choice about, make sure that your ethical and belief systems are in alignment with your employers, right? Or that sort of thing. Anybody else?
You could take the view that there's no such thing as a child, that a child always comes with a parent. It's the same thing.
Okay, that's one possibility. Anybody else?
Isn't it changing a little bit with the rise of the entrepreneurism and the actual sort of freedom of who we're working for, rather than just employment? So almost like a temporary workmanship.
Okay, it's another possibility.
I left 10 years ago an organisation because I couldn't make what I wanted to make.
What you wanted to make, was that an artistic expression or an ethical one?
It was ethical because they sold to clients not to help the client but to make money. Money was the superior architect in every single transaction, and I was trying my best to do the best for my clients, and I couldn't.
Yeah, it's hard, and the world is hard in that way. Like, we all have to eat, we all have to have a roof over our heads. It's usually about money, right? Even in nonprofits, it's about money. Can I get it? Who has it? Donations, right? And so it's difficult. It's difficult. So this is what I think. I think makers are free within a framework, right? And that we're all free within a framework. So I have a belief system that not everybody believes. That's why it's Lisa's belief system. Makes a few people crazy, and that is that we are always operating within a sort of deterministic environment that has some free agency involved, right? And I'm going to try and prove it to you. Right, so we operate in a controlled, standards-based environment. So this is an aerial view, sort of fractal-like view of the way that water flows, right? And you can think about it. Anyone been on an airplane, right? And you're looking down and you see rivers and streams. You've seen those patterns, am I correct? I mean, you're all visual people. You understand the patterns of nature and how they work, and that there are rules around how those things must work, right? There's not really random things. More intimate, our bodies, right? If we don't have the right number of chromosomes or there's something issues with it, then we don't get things like beautiful new babies, right, that are healthy, right? Things happen, right? So that's a standards-based framework, yet we all feel unique, right? So we're operating within this standards-based framework. Any of the technologies that we create, the ones that scale and that we really love a lot and are powerful, are all standards-based, right? So I would challenge you to find things that don't operate from natural models to forests to funguses to biological units, things that are not operating within a standards-based framework, right? And so that doesn't mean that, oh, everything's determined and I don't have any free will, right? But we are operating within a standards-based framework. And for us, those working us with digital technologies, we've got this. Our livelihood, it's all standards-based. This stuff wouldn't work, right? Wouldn't go through the browser, wouldn't come through the phone if it weren't for the standards. So the standards aren't the problem, and the deterministic nature of them is not the problem at all. And in fact, I think it's powerful, right? I don't care that I am a standards-based biological unit. That doesn't bother me. Maybe I've gone crazy or something. I don't have to actualize myself in that sort of unique kind of way. I'm actually grateful that I'm held together by standards. I'm grateful that there are standards that hold society together in such a way such that I can speak to you, right, in sort of English, right? Or that there are technologies, those are good things, right? Those are not necessarily bad things. And human beings are relatively unique in that we don't really want to be determined. We don't want to be in nature, all of the sort of man or woman against nature, man or woman against man, the whole ideas behind literature and the fight and Odysseus, and all those things are really about us sort of conquering things. We don't put ourselves in the fold, right, in the fold of standards. And I think if we change our minds about that and understand that we're in it, that there's actually going to be a little bit more flow, and we're going to enjoy the journey. So despite all of that and our standards-based thing, I still believe that we have agency, right, and that we can make choices. And so I'm almost done, and I'm almost done with my last piece of advice to you as well. So I'm in that part of the world right now that makes these things. At some point I'd like to go wherever it is in the UK where these beautiful starlings make these murmurations. So everyone loves these examples, and I think it was a couple years ago, there was some video of some girls in a canoe screaming happily because they'd never seen one before. And they're really quite startling, right? When you look, you can get mesmerized watching these videos of these huge groups of birds making these things and moving seamlessly together. And so this is this sort of big organic unit, just sort of shifting and moving together, seemingly without instructions, but seemingly together and making sort of beautiful things. So I went in and I wanted to do some research. Does any people know how this works? Do you know how they stay together? Right? And so I was really fascinated by that, right? That's like, how do they do that? That's the first thing you want to know. Like, is there a lead bird that decides where they're, well, this is what we would do, right? In us, it would be like, okay, you be the lead bird, and that would be like militaristically highly prescribed. But that's not how it happens. The way that it happens is that each bird pays attention to the 7 birds closest to it, and they stay with them. So they're in this big unit that's moving together in a sort of intuitive way, right? Instinctively moving together, whether or not they're fleeing predators, staying warm. There's all kinds of theories about why birds do these sorts of things or why these starlings do these things. But 7, and I thought that was interesting because we've got our 7 plus or minus 2 rule, right, about the amount of things that people can remember. They stay with the closest 7, and then they move. They're not moving like this. They're moving like this. which is why you get that flow, right? Instead of you getting this sort of mass moving all together in one direction in sort of precision, sort of like what are those swimmers, synchronized swimmers that do those sort of swimming dances? It's not like that. It's a sort of other thing. So that's where the agency is, right? And the mystery is, what's the bird that changes? Who's the bird that's first? And I would say to you, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter, but that they do move, and that inside your head you have this understanding of where you want to go, complete with your ethical values, whether it's outside of an organization to someplace else. But if you can influence the 7 birds around you, you'll go together and you'll go in a good direction. So there are a lot of us in this room, right? And so if we can make that move, I think there are lots of places that we can go. So what can you do? You can just be a bird. You do not have to worry about getting the boss to sign up, right? You don't have to worry about bringing everybody else along with you. You all probably know from your own experience how one individual, maybe even a stranger that you met, influenced you to change something, right? Just from that one interaction. So sort of release that fear and release the responsibility that you have to change the whole organization, right? Not going to happen. I want you to turn. I want you to turn and just take us with you. I'll go with you. Everybody's going to go in the good direction. I feel like that's a human nature and the way that things are going to happen. So that's my recommendation to you and my response to Vint, which is every good thing too. Every good thing. He might be sinister about it or upset about it because it was his creation and it didn't go the way, but we don't have to be that way. We don't have to fall down into that chasm. We can make every good thing happen. That's it. Thanks.